Good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's Shute Festival event. My name is Bijan Omrani. I'm co-director of the Shute Festival and editor of the Asian Affairs Journal. A warm welcome to everyone who is joining us today, whether from the local area, from the East Devon area of outstanding natural beauty, or indeed further afield throughout the UK and around the world. It's very good to see you all here. And please do put your greetings in the chat box, and indeed any questions that you might like to ask during the course of this evening's event. Of course, as ever, a special thanks to our local independent bookshop in Axminster, Archway Books. And right at the top of the chat box, there is a link to buy our author's excellent book that we're going to be speaking about this evening, Empireland. And this is a good moment to indeed welcome our guest this evening, Sathnam Sanghera. Great pleasure to have you with us here this evening. Sathnam is a journalist and a writer. He read English at Christ College, Cambridge, and came out with a first-class degree. He's written for the Financial Times and currently the Times and elsewhere. He's won a number of awards for his journalism and also a number of awards as a writer of books. His first book, The Boy With The Topknot, a memoir of love, secrets and lies in Wolverhampton, was shortlisted for the Costa Biography Award and was also dramatised on British television on BBC Two with the highest rated single drama of the year, described as a smash hit by the Radio Times. And his novel, Marriage Material, was similarly shortlisted for a Costa Prize. But this evening, we're going to be talking about his most recent book, Empireland, which I'm going to wave in front of the camera inelegantly, how imperialism has shaped modern Britain. Sathnam, a very warm welcome to you here this evening. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me on. Where is Shute again? Remind me. It's in beautiful Devon.
Shute is in beautiful Devon. It's on the East Devon border, very close to Lyme Regis and Axminster, and sort of from the Devon-Dorset, Somerset meeting of counties. So we're in the rural southwest, West Country.
I know Lyme Regis very well. I'm a big fan of John Fowles.
Excellent. Well, that shows very great. That shows very great taste. I hope his house isn't going to be blown into the sea in this filthy weather we're having. But actually, I mean, that consciousness of our local area, Lyme Regis, Shute. I mean, those of us who are sitting here, if I say that one of the things, I think the main thing that your book is doing is trying to bring to our consciousness the continuing legacy that empire has for Britain in all sorts of areas and aspects. I mean, if one is sitting here looking out at the East Devon countryside in a sort of little rural village, and in our local church there is a memorial to some poor fellow who fell out of a boat in the Bay of Bengal in 1876, and so on. And we're surrounded by English countryside, and sort of pastoral landscape, and filthy British weather. Well, we might say a monsoon, of course. The empire, one might say, feels very distant and a long time ago. I mean, how is that, in your view, a sort of mischaracterization of the way things are?
Well, I would say empire is absolutely everywhere. So let's have a look. I mean, I'm drinking tea. Imperial products.
Yes.
And the millions made from tea by the British over the years. Of course, a crop that initially was grown in China and the British took to India. That's why the Indians have tea. It's sweetened with sugar. Famous crop, which was supported, well, it was harvested by slaves quite often, and was, of course, as an abolition as well. And when good British people stopped taking sugar in their tea because they objected to the slave trade. I think I got this mug from the V&A. V&A is a museum which exists primarily because of empire, because the East India Company had a museum in the city, and when the East India Company came into government ownership, the museum was absorbed by the V&A. And then not least, I'm Indian, right? I'm British Asian. I wouldn't be here unless some British people had invaded India in the 17th century. And I'm less sure of Iranian history, Bijan, but I suspect empire played a role in you being here. Am I right?
Well, I mean, the British were certainly present in Persia. I mean, they occupied it for periods during the World Wars. And by strange coincidence, my mother's family is English, and one of them was actually a spy with the British Empire in India who went into Persia and played a role in defining the northern Afghan border. So a strange mixture of empire and not. Of course, the French Empire also has a great role to play in Iran. But I mean, just being fixed on the British Empire and that legacy for us here today. So I mean, just sitting around us. I mean, you mentioned tea, sugar, nice souvenir mugs from the Victoria and Albert Museum that we might have around the house. So we notice it's all around us. And I mean, you just spoke about your your own identity as a British person, but you have a Punjabi background, a Sikh background. I mean, is a consideration of all of that and perhaps the complexity that you feel something that's prompted you to write the book at this particular time?
Yeah, I guess it was a slow process, but when you write a book, often there's 500 different inspirations, not one point, but then you have to publicize it, and you kind of claim there was just one point. But I probably a big moment for me was making a documentary about Jallianwala Bagh at the Amritsar massacre of 1919, when up to 900 Indians were murdered by the British for just, I guess, resisting colonial, actually just protesting about something. And it was going to India and realizing that the Indians were very aware of British Empire. They all knew, the man on the street knew the imperial history, and yet I didn't. And despite having supposedly one of the best educations on the planet, I hadn't been taught anything about British Empire, hardly anything. I mean, even when we talked about things with the imperial dimension, like World War I, World War II, it was never mentioned that, tens of thousands of Sikhs fought for the country that colonized them. And it just struck me that we don't really think about empire. And when we do, it's in this strange nostalgic way through kind of sepia tones, kind of Raj nostalgia in the form of films. We don't really think about the 500 years of empire. We see ourselves primarily as a country that won World War II, not as the country that had the greatest empire in human history, which I thought was peculiar, and it was worth investigating, not least because it explained why I'm here in the first bloody place. So I was just trying to make sense of it.
So yeah, I mean that's an incredibly striking thought in terms of our national identity and our awareness of our own history. And I mean, as you say, I mean, I think of our local church, and there's one memorial to the chap who fell into the sea at the Bay of Bengal, sort of in the corner. There's another mention of a person who was engaged in the suppression of the slave trade. There's another memorial to a person I know had a share in the St. Kitts plantation, but it doesn't actually mention that fact. But, I mean, it seems extraordinary. I mean, how is it? We'll sort of start exploring this notion of why does our education system give us so little access to this history of, I think you mentioned in your book that the largest territorial extent of the British Empire was pretty much equivalent to the surface of the moon.
Yes.
Why don't we know that?
Twice the surface area of Pluto, which is a random fact I quite enjoy. I think there's multiple reasons behind it. First of all, empire happened abroad. We're not like the French after World War II, where we have ever had to face up to our history because it was always foreign. It was always out of sight. And there's evidence that even at the height of empire, when we ruled a quarter of the planet, awareness of empire within Britain was actually still quite low. Secondly, I think it's really complicated. 400 to 500 years. It was good. It was bad. It was often. He ended up, at one point, we were engaged in the slave trade. Then we were against the slave trade. At one point, we encouraged British people to have relationships with Indian women. Another time, we were very much against it. It was so complicated. It took me 4 years to get my head around it. So if it took me 4 years, the average man on the street is not going to be able to understand it. And thirdly, I just think it's incredibly painful because there's no going over the fact that there were a certain number of massacres. There was a genocide in Tasmania. For at least 150 years, it was an exercise in willful, proud white supremacy. And that challenges our idea of us as an anti-racist country, because we beat the evil racist Nazis, right? We abolished slavery, but actually we were also responsible for creating many modern ideas of racism. We exported racism around the world. And so that is deeply problematic. And how do we get our head around that? It's easier not to think about it. Actually, I found something. Someone sent me this book today, which is Our Empire Story, written by H.G. Marshall. And I looked in the index for slavery. It mentions slavery, but only the abolition. It doesn't mention that we actually pioneered slavery for 100 years, that we sent 3 million Africans across the Atlantic. That says a lot, I think.
Yeah, so all of these strands, I mean, the sort of difficulty of confronting some aspects of our own past, complexity, as you say, is a very important, I think, keynote of your book. And I mean, just looking at this idea of complexity, it makes it incredibly difficult to come to a real calculation of the way that Britain related to the empire and for judgment to happen. I mean, I think one of the extraordinarily balanced things about your book is that you don't necessarily say empire bad, empire good, but empire complex. One of those areas is the way that you discuss the question of the economic relationship between Britain and the empire. And you say, you observe and talk about the academic debate that some people say, yes, I mean, you have this idea of the drain that Britain sucked trillions of pounds out of the empire, and others say, well, actually, that's perhaps a simplification, or the dependency is too complex to say. I just wonder if you can elaborate on some of those points and some things for us to think about in that area.
Yeah, thanks for actually raising that, Bijan, because that was by far the hardest chapter. It's commonly said a lot of our wealth comes from empire. Sadiq Khan said that, I think, last year, and it's a commonly said thing by Black Lives Matter protesters, who I have sympathy with, but actually it's not true, in the sense that you can't prove it. Economics is even more complex than history. It's a matter of opinion. And to say that we stole a load of stuff from India, which we did, because even the word loot is a Hindu word. We stole so much, we even stole the word. But you can't measure it, because how can you tell how much of the wealth we stole and how much of it was freely given? Some of it was genuine trade. And when people put numbers on it, some people say, we stole $45 trillion from India. Some people say we owe $777 trillion in compensation for the slave trade, as the West as a whole. I think the bigger the figure, the less reliable it is. It's much better to look at specific things. So you can say Liverpool became the giant city that it is because of colonial trade. Glasgow became the city it is today because of empire. It was the second city of empire. Whole parts of London, the Docklands, were created because of imperial trade. You can say, look, Clive of India became wealthy to the modern equivalent of £700 million. He spent, 15 years in India? I don't know how many, but about. He only went to India 3 times, and he got £700 million. I would say a lot of that was not legitimate. I'm guessing a lot of that was stolen, right?
And he didn't like it much. Well, the country, that is. He liked the
No,
money,
he
but not
hated
the
it.
country.
He hated the Indians. He said he was miserable there. And actually, he killed himself. And Samuel Johnson speculated, he killed himself because he was ashamed of what he'd done to India, because there were famines going on at the time. This is the other thing. People now talk up and celebrate Clive of India. At the time, there were British people who hated him in massive numbers. Horace Walpole ranted about him. He was forced in front of Parliament, a select committee, for 3 days, forced to justify his wealth. And this is a really important thing not to forget. At the time, some of these things were unpopular. When the statue of Clive of India was put up in Whitehall, the Viceroy of India himself said, this is needlessly provocative, because he was so unpopular. And now, if someone says, that statue should come down, you get accused of being woke and a snowflake. Well, if I'm a snowflake, so is Samuel Johnson,
Yes, I'd be interested to see whether he would put the word snowflake in his dictionary.
I bet I want to look it up.
Well, yeah, we'll see what he says. I mean, just taking that thought further, and again, I think this is a very important strand in your book. The reactions of people in Britain to empire, not just to the people who made big money out of empire, the nabobs, as they were called. British people might have said, "Oh, these vulgarians going over to India, looting the place," as they now say, and bringing all the money back, buying up our country houses, and kicking out all the old Elizabethan gentry. But actually, as you elaborate, the attitude towards the whole question, the whole enterprise of the development of colonies, the annexation of territories abroad, wasn't something that was met with equanimity either early on or necessarily even in the high period of empire, even in the 19th century.
No, there was constant debate. I mean, the people who railed against empire were some of them really spite. I mean, Queen Victoria complained about Lord Kitchener taking the skull of someone he'd conquered and said it smacked too much of medieval times. Gladstone railed against, imperialism throughout his career, even though he came from slave money. Complexity again, isn't it? And there was such complex attitudes. I mean, bizarrely, I was really surprised to find out that people who gained money from slavery were more accepted than the people who gained money from India, because the upper classes could understand plantations because they were like the country houses, right? Whereas getting all this money from nowhere in India was seen as dodgy. The nabobs were the equivalent of, say, the Russians in London now. We didn't quite trust where they got their money from, but attitudes were incredibly complex, and there was constant dispute and conversation and complaints about empire. I mean, Richard Cobden, one of the great free traders, was massively against imperial kind of annexation. He believed in free trade, but he thought forcing countries under your governance was immoral and wasn't in line with free trade thought. So it was very complex, and right up to Orwell, who was a child of empire, who then railed about it, and wrote amazing essays complaining about what colonization did to you as a human being. From the beginning to the end, people complained about it.
Yes, I mean, those remarkable Orwell essays, really worth reading about. The elephant gun and, the hanging. Those are extraordinary pieces of writing from sort of the late imperial time.
Incredible, yeah. I mean, his essay on that elephant, and he concludes that ultimately there's something ridiculous about the British, and what drives the colonialists is the fear of being laughed at, which is really interesting, because there's a lot written about how colonization affects the psychology of the colonized, but actually how it affects the colonizers is just as interesting. And I think it can brutalize them in a quite similar way. And a lot of people involved in it, not least Orwell, didn't want to be involved in it.
Well, all of these ideas, it leads on to a very significant part of your book, which is the way that, there's a lot of discussion about cultural artifacts and so on, which I think we might come back to later on in the discussion. And I should just say to everyone, do put questions in the box. We might sort of deal with them during the course or at the end. There's a lot of discussion about all sorts of extraordinary ways that the possession of empire and the encounters with empire have changed Britain in terms of its national psyche. And there are some very light ones and some very dark ones. We might start with one of the lighter ones, is that it's had an impact on the way that British travel and the way that British go abroad, partly in terms of the way that the British have gone abroad for good, but also the way that the British comport themselves when they do go abroad.
Yeah, I recognize this in myself, in that I go, as a young man, I was a foreign correspondent, I'd go abroad and I just assume people could speak English. That goes back to an imperial attitude, right? And you go around, you just expect people to be interested in the fact that you're British. But this is the corollary to, the fact that multiculturalism in Britain is a consequence of imperialism. We are a multicultural society because we had a multicultural empire, but also we emigrated, and we continue to emigrate like almost no other country in the world, because that's what we did in empire. It's in our blood. We're not scared of going anywhere. And I find this wherever you go in the world, there's some British people. Also, they're behaving in a very British way. They're probably eating British food. They're probably having gin and tonics. They're probably not learning the language. They're probably not integrating. And yet we complain about when immigrants don't integrate here, you know? And I think those traditions continue.
Well, I'm sure the gin and tonic is entirely for health reasons and nothing more than that.
Of course, the gin and tonic came about because of imperialism, because British people in India and Africa didn't want to get malaria, so they had quinine in their gin.
Well, I mean, moving on from the gin and tonic to, I mean, a much more serious result. And there's a long discussion of your book in the way that that empire has developed attitudes towards racism in Britain itself, but also anti-racism. And again, the note of complexity in the way that this these strands emerge is again something you really delve into. Empire, I mean, as I say, it can't really be characterized as anything else but a racist enterprise, because it reserved the powerful positions for people from Britain, and it didn't allow them, except at a much less senior level, to people from the colonized countries. But on the other hand, it exposes British people historically who were in empire to other people and other cultures. And I mean, is that really the origin of the complex relationship that Britain has with racism and anti-racism today, do you think? Is that a legacy, a direct legacy?
I've got to say, my argument about empire having created a certain tradition of anti-racism, not many historians agree with me. So many people wanted me to take that out of the book, because I had it read by 6 historians. But I think there's no, in my opinion, abolition became a model for all sorts of social justice movements. The suffragettes based a lot of their campaigning on what had been achieved with abolition. And I think it became a model for the Chartists and all sorts of campaigns. But I think we have a particular flavor of racism in this country, and it goes back to empire. I mean, the way the Sikhs were treated, I tried to argue in the book, was the way they were treated in empire, in that we were in some ways indulged. You know, we were called a military race. The British fetishized us, and we fetishized ourselves in that image. Continue to think of ourselves in the imperial image as a martial race. But at the same time, when my parents' generation came to Wolverhampton, they found themselves excluded from certain jobs in the way they were in Imperial India. They couldn't buy houses, they couldn't live in certain areas because of their race. Same thing in India. The white people lived very much away from the brown people in Amritsar, for example. The color bar, I mean, in general, in Imperial India, at the height of it, European people socialized in clubs away from the Indians. And there was a color bar in Wolverhampton in some working men's clubs until 1984. And then there's the racial violence, of course. I mean, Sikhs were subject to racial violence at Jallianwala Bagh and at other occasions. And then when my parents came here in the 60s, they faced, you know, Paki bashing. And it almost became a sport to beat up an Asian on a Friday night. So I argue our racism goes back to empire, a lot of it anyway.
Yes, and I mean, your discussion of that very ambiguous relationship that the British had with the Sikhs historically is, I think, very resonant. I mean, some of my own work has been on the history of the British relationship with Afghanistan, and of course, on the borders of that was the great Sikh leader Maharaja Ranjit Singh, and the British were in extraordinary awe of him as a military leader and someone who could practice the art of governance, but also as just a human figure. He was extraordinary to them. But then again, the way that they were treated in Amritsar is so extraordinarily contrary to that, and the contempt that the British military commander Dyer had towards them is so different.
And occasionally,
schizophrenic almost, you might say.
Occasionally, they blew Sikhs up by strapping them to the end of cannons and blowing them to pieces. But there was a respect towards the Sikhs, not only because they took the side of the British at the mutiny, but because they were the last to take on the British, and they almost won. If it wasn't for some treachery towards the end, the 2 Anglo-Sikh wars could have ended the Raj, you know. And so there was some lingering respect, also some quite bizarre fetishization of the way Sikhs looked. You know, we were seen as a military people because I think we looked military, not that I do, but like with a turban and a big beard. And the British did the same for the Gurkhas. They did the same for the Highlanders. And often the Highlanders and Sikhs fought together, which is why you have this bizarre spectacle at some Sikh weddings of bagpipers appearing to play Loch Lomond. It goes back to that time where the British made us fight together and they fetishized the way we fought.
Yes, I mean, I think you often see this in some colonial writing where there's a great comparison between the sort of Scottish Highlanders and people in the frontiers, especially the Pashtuns. This is just like Scotland, wonderful, and sort of these sort of powerful martial races.
Yeah, no, I don't know enough about Afghanistan. I must read your book because I really want to find out more. But the British fetishized Afghanis because they were defeated by them repeatedly. Am I right?
I think that's one reason. I think they respected their capacity to outwit and beat the British repeatedly in their campaigns, and I suppose the strength of some of the later Afghan leaders. In fact, they could never quite get to grips with the country, and that probably is a very important part of it. So, I mean, some other areas which you look at. I mean, I think we'll look at some of the grander areas. Is this notion that there's also, aside from racism and anti-racism, attitudes in governance. I mean, the way that the government behaves nowadays in terms of its feelings about foreign policy and just the way that it projects itself from day to day in terms of its attitudes and its claims for itself and its claims for its capacity.
Yeah, and
how is
this
that?
actually something Jeremy Paxson picked up in his book on Empire, and he says that all our prime ministers in modern memory have had an imperial tone of voice. We're a tiny country, aren't we? And yet all of our prime ministers in our lifetimes have lectured the world. What's that about? Why are we doing that? It's because we ran a quarter of the bloody planet, and we continue to pontificate. We continue to get involved in things that probably aren't our business, because we feel like it's our responsibility. And when you read the way 19th century politicians talked about the world, it echoes the way David Cameron and Tony Blair talked about the world. This feeling, oh God, we've got to get involved even though we don't want to, because we have this paternalistic need to. But also there's a sense of exceptionalism, the idea that we don't have to obey the rules when it comes to coronavirus or Brexit, because we're special. We're not alone in this. I think there's American exceptionalism, isn't there? Increasingly, there's Chinese exceptionalism. But until those arrived, British exceptionalism was one of the loudest things in the world.
So in a sense, we are still dealing with this notion of the white man's burden, as one might like to have said earlier on in the last century.
Yeah, and you heard it. And when Boris Johnson got sick, you had people like Toby Young saying, "Oh, I always knew he was going to survive because I knew there's something special about a British prime minister." The idea he was immortal or kind of immune to this illness goes back to empire, because we're special. We are the race that colonized a quarter of the bloody planet. Of course, there's something special about us, isn't there? It has to be. And I feel that even as a British Asian, I've been imbibed in it through our school system, through our media, through the jingoism of our newspapers.
Well, I mean, some other areas, I mean, they're not sort of necessarily so dangerous either to ourselves or the rest of the world. I mean, just some smaller areas of what we see as British national character. We have the suspicion of cleverness and our self-deprecation, and heroic failure and the Dunkirk spirit.
Oh God, I was thinking about that today. About we've got a tradition of resisting cleverness. We don't prize cleverness; we prize streetwiseness. And I was reading today about how Boris Johnson can actually speak 3 languages. He can speak fluent French, but when he speaks French on TV, he speaks franglais. He doesn't want to imply. He doesn't want people to think he's really clever, because clever people weren't the people who built the empire. It was practical people. It was good sportsmen, and being good at sport is the thing that the public school system prizes above intellect, right? And continues to. And the people we value in our politics are those who get things done. We are distrustful of the cleverest. I remember Boris Johnson also calling David Cameron a girly swat, for knowing too much about a topic. I think there's a reason we elected this guy who acts like a bumbling idiot, but yet isn't. It's very interesting.
Yes, I mean, well, having had the very interesting experience of having taught at that school, and I mean, of course, Boris was a scholar, and the way that scholars would, I think, dissemble their cleverness by affecting strange interests, I don't know, in the Romanian Football League or something absolutely bizarre, is in a sense very indicative. But I mean, at the same time, I think that backbone of cleverness was there. I mean, the exam for the Indian Civil Service, I think, was formidable, and the efforts that went into language training, so Haileybury, for example, were extraordinary.
So the East India Company set up basically a language school, and it's now a very popular public school, right? But then we became a country that didn't learn the language. Now, Enoch Powell, who wanted to be Viceroy of India, famously learned Urdu. But now we're defined as a nation that doesn't learn other languages. I think we have very poor learning of foreign languages compared to the EU. Someone just pointed out a factual error saying that the East India Company museum didn't transfer to the V&A, transferred to the South Kensington Museum, but then the South Kensington Museum became the V&A. What I wanted to say was the East India Company Museum ended up, a lot of the collection, a lot of it ended up in the V&A. Some of it is in the British Museum.
Yeah, thanks for that point, both contributing and just getting those facts straight. I mean, on education as a tool of colonialism, I mean, you speak about the ideas of Edward Said and his notions of Orientalism, and how powerful you found those ideas. The idea that a lot of the education that we have in the West, not only is it unaware of empire, but it has historically acted as a belittlement and a tool of domination of people in colonies. I mean, this is an interestingly contested idea because some scholars have responded to Said. I mean, I think of Robert Irwin, for example, in A Lust of Knowing, where he tries to argue that one of the legacies of empire, and many of the scholars who engaged with empire were not necessarily interested in domination or belittling, but they in fact fell in love with the cultures that they discovered, and they made a very important contribution to informing not only the West, but also, I mean, cataloguing them, getting them on paper, and developing scholarly studies, say, I think particularly in Asia. I mean, is that notion of Orientalism, I think, clear-cut?
No, it's complex, and they were amazing. I mean, the British preserved and recorded to such an amazing degree in a way that is considered valuable by the colonized. Thank God they did some of this stuff. But I mean, I guess the most surprising point of the journey for me in the book was, realizing that despite my excellent education, I'd had a certain view of the world instilled into me. And I realized when, a lot of the Indian kingdoms weren't ultimately defeated on the battlefield. They were defeated in the classroom. And with the Sikh kingdom ended ultimately when the descendant of Ranjit Singh was sent to Britain and had a very British education, became a pet of Queen Victoria, and then rebelled, decided he was Sikh. He didn't want to convert to Christianity. I think that happened routinely. The British saw education as a tool of colonialism. They were honest about it. They talked about it. They wanted to create this kind of social class of English Indians. And I guess I realized that I was probably one, in that despite my excellent education, I was really uninformed about India, and all my impressions of India came via the British, a lot of them. And even when there were opportunities to learn about empire, I was taken away from them. Jane Austen is a good example. I mean, Edward Said uses Jane Austen's Mansfield Park as one of his illustrations. Very useful for me because that was an A-level set text for me. And I hated that book because I just couldn't relate to anything in it. And I was like, why am I studying this? I studied it. And then I realized at the age of 44, via Edward Said, that there's a whole subplot in that book about slavery. All the rich people in that book were slave owners. Jane Austen's whole family were involved in slavery. Some of them were involved in abolition, as we learned in the Times today. But none of that came up when I was taught about it. We didn't talk about it. And that blew my mind, just realizing there were so many things that I could have been taught about. Even when we were taught about the Tudors, no one said to me, oh, there were black people in Henry VIII's court. You know, Queen Elizabeth I was complaining about there being too many black people in 1600. You know, and you know what? World War One, World War Two, lots of brown people were involved. A lot of the money from empire was used to win those world wars. It was not mentioned once. So I guess it was Edda Said who made me realize that I've been colonized in a way.
I mean, it's very interesting. I mean, in terms of this question of amnesia, I mean, I might mention that we find the first record of a black person here in Shute in rural Devon in the 1600s, in about 1610,
Oh, really?
as a servant of the local manorial house. I mean, we're trying to find out more about her.
Do you think she might have been a slave?
We just don't know yet. I mean, we've only got an entry in a burial register, but you know, time to get in the archives when they reopen after the pandemic.
That's a very interesting point, because there's a common popular view that we had no slavery in Britain, but actually there were slaves in Britain, in that there's hundreds of adverts from owners of slaves in Britain trying to find runaway slaves. They were published in newspapers, so there was slavery. There was a slave in Wolverhampton, in the Molyneux House, which is now the name of a Wolverhampton Wanderers Stadium, right? So we are kind of in weird denial about that as a nation.
Well, hopefully we'll be able to tell everyone more about that at a future date when I get my hands dusty in the archives. But I mean, staying on a historical point, and this is a very interesting thing earlier in the book, another area of amnesia is, I mean, going back to our museums and our cultural artifacts, and how did we end up with all of these? I mean, where did they come from? In fact, you mentioned a very interesting tour from someone called Alice Proctor, who's one of my old students.
Oh, is she really?
I taught her Latin, but there was no discussion of art history, sadly. So it's good to see old students already making their way like that. But I mean, tell us about the problem of the provenance of these artifacts.
Yeah, I mean, Alice Proctor has been running these uncomfortable art tours of the British Museum, the V&A, and various art galleries, pointing out the colonial provenance of and the contested nature of some of these items that were arguably stolen and or taken under duress. And she had a massive influence in that the British Museum has started changing its labeling, and it started offering equivalent tours. So hats off to your student, and good work, Bijan. But
I was only talking about the imperfect subjunctive with her, certainly not.
I think you had a role. But yeah, I mean, I'm not someone who thinks that all of the British Museum's contents should be sent back. But we need to remember that some of the contested items were controversial at the time. So I could focus on the Tibet Expedition in 1903. It's such a fascinating thing that happened then. I mean, basically, we invaded Tibet because we wanted to find out more about it. There was no real reason for it. It was equivalent to North Korea. No white man had been into Tibet, hadn't been allowed. So we found a spurious reason to engage in war. We murdered thousands of Tibetans with machine guns, and they had no weaponry to defend themselves with. And then we stole a load of stuff, you know. And the Geneva Convention was a thing then. That's the thing. It was considered to be bad then. It was against the Geneva Convention to pillage and loot in 1903. So even at the time, there was outrage. Even at the time, there were all these telegrams saying, don't loot, stop looting from the British. But we took it all, and that stuff is in our museums. But I came across it bizarrely first when I was watching an episode of Flog It on BBC. When I was watching some guy saying, oh, you know, I found this thing in the attic and my uncle found it in the snow in Tibet. And he probably didn't find it. It was probably taken out of the hands of a murdered Tibetan. And so I think we need to acknowledge the fact that even at the time, there was outrage about how we got some of these things. Some of these things were human remains. You know, the British Museum, loads of our museums are full of skulls and body parts, which frankly should be repatriated, which we would repatriate if they were Jewish or if they were Nazi loot or in all sorts of other circumstances. But when it comes to empire, we're like, no, I'm not going to give it back.
Yes, I mean, I remember when I was at university, I mean, I was friends with a Tibetan scholar who was a PhD student. And we were sitting in the pub one day and he produced a thing out of his pocket, this little tube. And I thought, what's that? It's a flute. It's made out of a human thigh bone. Really? That's lovely. Would you like another gin and tonic? I mean, it's extraordinary the way these things are everywhere, and I mean, extraordinarily surprising. But yes, what should you do with these artifacts? It's a real challenging question. But I mean, one thing that the defenders of the British Museum as a concept might say is that you do have the capacity to see all of these artifacts side by side and to study them in a context, to understand, I suppose, universal human ideas and universal human desires and longings. I mean, is that a valid reason to prevent, or to stand against repatriation of cultural artifacts to people to whom these artifacts still have a meaning and they have a sense of continued ownership?
Yeah, I agree with that. And actually, I love the V&A, I love the British Museum, and they're great organizations. But when you're talking about the stuff that's being questioned, it's a very small amount of stuff. You know, the British Museum only displays 1% of its artifacts. I can't imagine more than 1% of those in return are disputed. So I would say those disputed ones, if there's a good claim, if there's a place to store them, it would benefit us. You know, you could have amazing scholarship. It could improve our relationships with the world at a time when we really need to improve our relationship with the world, you know? And it doesn't, I mean, David Cameron famously said, we can't give back the Koh-i-Noor Diamond because then all our museums will be empty. That's melodramatic. That ain't going to happen. We're talking about a tiny number of things, and it'd be good for our souls and good for the world.
I think one of the other areas of amnesia, I mean, I think it's a very important part of the book, so I do want to talk about it a bit. I mean, these ideas of amnesia is about, I mean, the presence of migrants from empire in Britain. So, I mean, we've forgotten where a lot of the cultural artifacts have come from, but we think they must belong here. You know, we've got the concept of the British Museum as a great centre of scholarship. But there are many people who were British subjects of empire who are here, and the presence of them, because of that fact that they were historically British subjects, has been contested by, of course, people particularly on the right. That is a strange contrast, I think, that you pick up in the book.
Yeah, no, it's if you were until recently, if you were a citizen of empire, you were a citizen of Britain, and the 1948 Nationality Act formalized that. And actually, the people on the Windrush, they weren't coming for jobs. They didn't have jobs lined up. They came purely because they were allowed to. They wanted to go to the mother country, you know, and it was encouraged. And now we're in a situation where imperial immigrants are seen as having come here uninvited. Some of them are being deported, even though they were citizens. I mean, that's not happening to white migrants. And that, for me, is a very clear illustration of institutional racism. But throughout history, in the last 400 or 500 years, there's been thousands, if not millions, of migrants from empire. And more often than not, we forget they were even here. So I concentrate on Dean Mohammed, who's one of the people I'm obsessed with. He was an Indian guy in the East India Company who came over with his Anglo-Irish boss, lived in Ireland, married an Irish woman. This is all in the 1700s, you know. Came to London, opened the first curry house, became famous, opened a shampooing salon, which is a kind of massage parlor. The king
now, yeah.
The word shampoo was popularized by him. Shampoo actually means kind of massage. And he became a shampoo surgeon to the king and the Prince of Wales. Wildly famous in his time. The first ever Indian to write a book in English. It was a terrible book, but he was the first. And as soon as he died, forgotten. I mean, I never talked about it. I never heard of the guy. And this happened routinely. I mean, quite a few slaves became wildly popular during abolition. And they were forgotten until recent times. And I think there's something in the British psyche that wants us to forget that empire even happened.
So, I mean, this is an important recovery of history, just in terms of what British history is, and that, I mean, people from the colonized lands and people of color have played an integral part in that.
Yeah, Black history is British history. You know, it's the same thing.
So, I mean, we've got questions coming in, and we'll move on to questions in a moment. I'll just ask a few questions, short questions too. Well, I don't think they can be short, but we'll try to wrap up this discussion and move towards some questions. I mean, what do people need to know about empire in Britain? What do they need to know to have a sort of citizen level grasp of our past? And I mean, just to take that further, I think one thing that you say is that this idea of imperial amnesia, the British use history to comfort themselves. The Germans use history to help them to think about the future and to move forward.
To understand themselves, yeah.
To understand themselves. How would that be applicable to us? What do we need to know, and how do we use that history to deal with our place in the world now?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's also facts we need to know about the fact that, imperial immigrants came here as citizens, and, facts about genocides and massacres. But actually, I think none of that matters as much as the point you've made, which is that to know British Empire was sometimes rotten does not mean you're not patriotic. There's an idea put about by English nationalists who are running the government at the moment that in order to be proud of being British, you need to be proud of imperial history, or proud of history. We're talking about 500 years of history here. A lot of good things happened, a lot of bad things. What does it mean to say you're proud of it? It's like, are you proud of what? Are you proud of slavery? Are you proud of abolition? You're proud of Lenny Henry, who's here because of empire? What are you proud of? It makes no sense. It's like trying to give a 5-star rating to your life on Amazon. It's not a kettle you're buying at Argos, It's much more complex. So if there's one thing I hope people absorb from the book, is that you can talk about these things, understand them, and it doesn't mean you're ashamed of being British. It just means you understand it. It's like having therapy or having marriage guidance. Just because you realize there's difficult things in your relationship doesn't mean you want to end it. It actually just means you understand it. It might actually even make it stronger. And I faced up to a lot of difficult things in this book. This made me even prouder of being British, because you can separate the two.
I'll just, wrap up my own questions. I'll try sort of throwing a little bit of a googly. And just also coming back to the Koh-i-Noor diamond. And I mean, of course, there's, been a recent book about it, notions that it should be repatriated. But the diamond has an extraordinary history in itself. I mean, it was in the hands of Ranjit Singh, the Sikh, great Sikh leader, but he himself took it in questionable circumstances from the king of Afghanistan, Shah Shuja Durrani. And his own forebears took it in very questionable circumstances from the kings of Persia, Nadir Shah. And it just leads one to sort of think about the question that empires are not just British. We weren't the only people who had empires. Empires are frequently, they're a condition of history, indeed, historically speaking, a human condition. And do other countries need to have a similar reckoning, I mean, whether they were themselves later colonized by the British or others, about anything in their own imperial pasts as well? I mean, is this a sort of a world problem and not just a British problem?
Totally. I mean, just because we had the biggest empire doesn't mean we had the only empire. And lots of countries, the Sikhs had the empire, and they are subject to the same nostalgia. You won't meet many Sikhs who say that the Sikh empire was anything other than cosmopolitan and benign. It probably wasn't. So I understand the desire to think the best, but we were the biggest. And the Koh-i-Noor diamond is actually a very bad example, because you're right, it's very complicated history. But a lot of the contested items is pretty straightforward. So, for example, Alice Proctor, when I went on a tour, she pointed out the shield that the British Museum had that was held by the first Australian Aborigine that Captain Cook encountered. That shield is kind of hidden away in a corner. It means not much to us. To the descendants of those Aborigines, it means a lot, because the person who owned that shield was probably shot. It's their first encounter with colonialism. It means a lot to that community which has been decimated We could give that back. It wouldn't really, I don't think anyone would really care. Not massively, It would mean a lot to that community. It would mean a lot to the Sikhs. Forget about the diamond. But it would mean a lot if a lot of our guru's artifacts, which are owned by the V&A, which are actually kept in bloody storage, were returned. This is the weird thing. I mean, imagine if in the Napoleonic Wars, the French had taken Stonehenge to Lille, and they didn't even display it. They kept it in storage. And they were like, you know what? We're not going to give it back. We're just going to keep it in storage. Imagine how offensive that is, because Stonehenge is not a valuable thing, but it means a lot to you, in terms of your identity and emotionally. And so I think a lot of the stuff is emotional. And the Kohinoor diamond is a bad example, because that's something that is valuable, objectively. I think it's probably the least important contested item. And now I've forgotten your question.
Well, no, I mean, well, I think you answered it in terms of that it's not only the British Empire that needs to sort of consider and be aware of its own imperial history. Yeah. I've hogged the questions, and I want to move on to some of the questions coming in from the audience. Thank you very much. There are some questions which I think fall into the same category, so I'm going to string them together. Fiona Anderson asks about your view on reparations for descendants of the enslaved. Is it a true recognition of Britain's role in slavery? Is that necessarily a financial one? And would you stop there considering the wealth taken from India? And Mark Bailey in the chat box also asks, are financial reparations for former colonies a viable way forward? How do you quantify that? I mean, we've touched on that in the discussion, but perhaps you'd like to elaborate on that.
Yeah, I know there's campaigns for reparations. The Caribbean countries, the CARICOM countries, have got a very detailed list of requests. They want a certain amount of money and support for their education and healthcare and for the trauma. And I think there's a very interesting conversation happening in America about this. I mean, Joe Biden's talking about the actual money that should be paid, and so has Kamala Harris. But I don't think we're anywhere near having that conversation in Britain. I think we don't even remember that empire happened. I think there's a popular view, a dominant view in Britain, that racism doesn't exist. You can't go from that to talking about reparations. We are nowhere near that conversation. And actually, we haven't even apologized. Actually, we've apologized as part of the Good Friday Agreement for loads of colonial atrocities in Ireland, actually. But when it comes to India or Africa or slavery, apart from Sadiq Khan, no politician has ever apologized. So we're nowhere near reparations. We need to talk about just understanding it. And after that, we need to talk about maybe apologizing. And then in some fantasy universe, we can talk about reparations, but a long way from that.
Some of the questions are about, I mean, two questions I can string together again. It's really about how history is being taught and used. So Rob asked, any thoughts about how right-wing think tanks are dealing with imperial history, e.g. the History Matters project? And another question, I mean, which I very much like as a former teacher, is what advice would you give to history teachers? And I think we can probably take those questions together. I mean, thinking as a teacher, I mean, if one starts to present some of these incredibly difficult facts at, say, where do you present, primary school level, secondary school level, particularly in a context where, say, you've got a class with people of many different origins and ethnic backgrounds, how do children potentially process some of the very painful things? And then could that cause more harm than good?
Yeah, I mean,
in a sense at that level.
Yeah, it's very painful history, but you got to remember the only compulsory history thing on the national curriculum is the Holocaust. You don't get anything more traumatic than that. And yet we teach that to 13, 14-year-olds. They can handle British Empire. You know what I mean? So I think that doesn't really count as an objection. It's complicated, but I think it explains a lot about modern Britain. It explains why we're a multicultural society. It explains why we have these really bizarre, endless conversations about race. And yet we don't teach it. So I would say it needs to become compulsory, like the Holocaust. And I think we talked about the slave trade a bit. But what was your first part of the question about History Matters? We've got to the History Matters campaign. We've got to recognize there's a massive backlash against Black Lives Matter and against this resurgence of interest in colonialism. And You know, we have the government saying they've introduced a free speech czar, they're against cancel culture. But what they're trying to do when it comes to woke people like me and left-wing historians is cancel us, because they're threatening to withdraw funding from any heritage organization that gets involved in these issues. You know, they're actually asking for trustees who are woke, who talk about decolonization, to be taken off the boards and replaced with sympathetic conservative trustees. I mean, in my view, that is one step away from burning books. What they're doing is cancel culture. And when the National Trust investigate the colonial link of their houses, they're doing academic research. They're doing what they're set up to do, which is to investigate history and to illuminate things. But our actual ministers want them to stop doing that. You know, there's the Charity Commission threatened to investigate the National Trust. It just happens to be the Charity Commission is run by a conservative politician. And so we have this culture war, and it's horrible because it's just getting more and more vicious, and it's not getting, there's no chance. I don't understand. I don't see how we're ever going to get to a consensus.
I mean, a question related to this, Omar Khan asks, do you really believe that on returning treasures from the Indian subcontinent, the Benin bronzes or the Elgin marbles could be maintained and restored to the standards they are in today? A lot could find them back on the market to the highest bidders.
Well, first of all, I would say that's a quite imperialist attitude, because actually there's a load of new museums in Africa. Loads being built. They're waiting to take the Benin bronzes. You know, if you have France are also doing, we've got to realize this is an international conversation. Germany is returning stuff from its empire. France, Macron is returning stuff from the French empire. And we are falling behind. And yeah, and this is a very imperial idea that, oh, you know, only we can look after these things. Guess what? There are museums in India. There are museums, increasingly very modern ones, in Africa. So we need to realize that.
Yes, and I think just a final question to wrap up. I mean, a very, very current question. Rhodes has risen back to the top of the news agenda today with a report recommending his removal from the front of Oriel College, Oxford, and the fellows of that college saying that it's a bit expensive and a planning hassle to take him down. So let's use the money to contextualize and offer scholarships to students from Southern Africa. I mean, what's your feeling about that response? I mean, is it better to spend that money on scholarships and contextualization and maybe put a traffic cone on his head in the streets?
I mean, I thought about this a lot because all of this statue stuff erupted whilst I was finishing the book, and I wrote a chapter about statues, but ultimately I concluded I didn't include it because I don't think statues matter that much. They're street furniture. They're propaganda. They are not history. There's an idea that if you remove statues, you delete the history. You know what? We still talk about Nazi Germany, even though all of Hitler's statues went. We still talk about the Iraq War, even though Saddam Hussein's statues went. It doesn't matter if they're taken down or kept up. I emotionally have no problem with Rhodes being taken down. But if I had to decide, I would keep him, and I would contextualize it. I would explain it, because I think those statues can remind people of the good and bad that happened around that time. But I think we're overly obsessed with statues when there's much more important things to think about, like our multiculturalism, like our racism. So yeah, I'm inclined probably to agree with the dons who think that money should be put into changing people's lives, but also understand emotionally the significance of Rhodes fucking off in Oxford.
I don't know. I think maybe the traffic cone might well be the solution. I mean, I think if I regain any youthful high spirits that I once had, we might try that out. I'm going to apologise to people whose questions I haven't been able to get through, and say a huge thank you to Sathnam. This is an incredibly rich book. It's full of stuff, incredibly thought-provoking, but it's a very, very good read as well. So I'd very much urge everyone to use the link at the top of the chat box to go to our local indie bookstore, buy a copy, get reading, and get thinking. It's been a really engaging discussion.
Well, thanks for your
And,
questions. Can you tell me the
huge-
title of your book about Afghanistan? Because
my book,
I need to learn about it.
Oh, well, Imperial Self-Deprecation. I say it's more about you, but my own book about Afghanistan is Afghanistan, A Companion and Guide. It's a very...
That's what I need.
Well,
I need a companion and guide.
well, there you are. Well, a huge thank you for a really stimulating and enjoyable discussion. And before I wrap up, just a couple of housekeeping notices. Firstly, our next event, again, a sort of deep existential topic, next Thursday, the 27th of May, we're going to be joined in a panel by Sadita Helm, who's Professor of Economic Policy at the University of Oxford. I don't know if he's getting his traffic cone ready to shin up the front of Oriel, and international lawyer Susan Shaw. And they're going to be talking about climate change and the environment. And also, the first in-person Shute Festival event will be happening, I think, on the 3rd of June, where I myself will be doing a limited to 20 people walk and talk around our little hamlet of Shute, speaking about our local history and our local monuments. I won't be toppling any statues, but hopefully it will be instructive. So if you're interested, please go to our website where details are for booking into both of those events. So finally, thank you to all of our audience from all over the world for your questions and comments. Thank you again to Sathnam for a really enjoyable and interesting and stimulating and important discussion, and very much hope to see you all next time. Thank you all very much.
Nice to meet you all. I hope to see Shute one day, very soon.
I hope to welcome you down here as well and to tell you more about it. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Bijan. Thank you.
Thanks.
Take care.
Bye-bye.